You're listening to Radio VR in Washington. I'm Andrew Hiller, where we look under America's armor at the social, economic, and political instances which affect our culture. Right now, we're going to take a look at Rubin Hurricane Carter, who died yesterday from the effects of pancreatic cancer. Carter was a middleweight boxer who climbed nearly to the profession's highest rungs. Though he never won the belt, he was a well-regarded fighter who ultimately became more famous for how he was removed from society and how long it took him to return. Carter's freedom became an issue for advocates, fellow boxers, and even pop stars like Bob Dylan.
Here comes the story of the hurricane, the man the authorities came to blame for something that he never done. Put in a prison cell, but one time he could have been the champion of the world.
Now, pugilism is sometimes strangely called the sweet science. But if it is a science, perhaps in the United States, it's been a social science, one which forces many to come to the fact, to face with some of our greatest failings and our baser instincts. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that throughout the 20th century, race has also come into play in the headlines and the rings. And whether you talk about athletes who were hugely popular and hated, like Jack Johnson, who was a question that society needed to solve in the ring by a great white hope, or outside the ring with the case of an individual like middleweight fighter Rubin Hurricane Carter, this has always been a constant reflection of us. Sometimes the look under America's armor smells of blood, sweat, tears, and even lies. Welcome, Jody.
It's good to be back with you, Andrew.
First, can you place Hurricane Carter in time and context? Before his arrest, before the trial and imprisonment, who was he and how was he perceived? How were black boxers regarded in 1963?
Oh, yeah. Well, black boxers, going back to Jack Johnson, as you mentioned, the first black heavyweight champion who created a real stir across America in winning the belt. And you remember there were, even Hitler had ideas about racial superiority that could be proven through athletic endeavors until Jesse Owens went over there and shattered some of those illusions. But we had those same kind of beliefs in the American setting as well, that somehow, you know, white superiority could be proven in the fighting ring or on the gridiron and these other sporting arenas. And so Jack Johnson challenged that and got many death threats as a result of it. Joe Louis did as well. Of course, Muhammad Ali was an explicitly kind of political boxer, and he would talk about white folks boxers versus black folk boxers, even when he had a black opponent. So he understood, as many do, that there's a political dimension to sports in general and boxing in particular, and Hurricane Carter really made that problem even more acute for many Americans and may have led to his legal woes by being outspoken about racial justice and civil rights at the time. And so Muhammad Ali, outspoken about civil rights and racial justice, was a pariah for a long time, couldn't get any kind of commercial contracts, you know, and others who speak out in that way especially become lightning rods for antagonistic responses from police and others who are trying to maintain or support the status quo. And back then, the status quo was Jim Crow. So he came up in that. He came from a troubled background. He wound up in juvenile homes and wound up in prison before he actually started boxing in the ring. He had a disciplinarian father who turned him into the police when he was very young, and so he had a lot of kind of challenges to overcome. But he's also a story of redemption. You know, you talked about Passover, the last conversation we had. You know, yesterday was Easter, and in my religious tradition, we think a lot about redemption, personal redemption. And his story was truly a story of personal redemption, you know, a kind of resurrection, if you will, of who he is and who he became. He became this very respectable boxer. They actually played on the fact that he'd been in prison as part of his boxing persona, saying it made him especially ferocious. You know, he has the visage of a ferocious prison inmate, that he carries into the ring with him. So they played on that, and he generated a lot of receipts of doing it, but he also became an outspoken critic of racial injustice. And ultimately, and we can get more into that, Andrew, that may have led to his undoing legally.
And that's exactly where I want to kind of go. So you had this person who was a bit of a celebrity. He was an advocate. He was a loudmouth. And suddenly he's being charged with murdering 3 people. Clearly he is a celebrity to a degree. Was the trial very sensational, and was there a tremendous amount of pressure to get a conviction?
Oh yeah, there was back in the '60s. We have to remember '66. We're just the Watts riots were just a little earlier than that. There was a lot of concern about Malcolm X was out there talking about the ballot or the bullet. You had a lot of folks talking. The FBI was concerned about and came up with COINTELPRO to kind of neutralize what they saw as black militancy of different kinds in the name of civil rights and social justice. So there was a real concern about making sure that folks weren't encouraged in those kinds of more militant critical responses. And at roughly the same time he was going through what he was going through, my own old man, my own dad, Andrew, had some similar legal woes. And, he was another big black man, who was critical of the status quo and had the temerity to flout his disregard of that status quo by marrying a redheaded Irish Catholic white woman, and that, the Loving Virginia, the U.S. Supreme Court case that said you could not make interracial marriages void, you couldn't make them illegal. That case wasn't decided until much later, after hurricanes in my dad's case, So you really did have criminal law in those days. My dad ultimately won his own vindicatory appeal. Took him 5 years to do it. After he was falsely imprisoned for 22 to 55 for possession and sale of weed. He ultimately vindicated himself in a case called Armour versus Salisbury, very much like Hurricane Carter, ultimately vindicated himself, but he lost 20 years of prime life in the process, right? And so he is someone to remember at moments like this as one of the martyrs for, in a sense, a certain kind of social and racial justice. I know that's strong language, and we can get into why I use that later, but that's kind of how I see him.
When the verdict announced, was it immediately controversial, or was it just a case of, well, we knew this. This is how society works?
Well, one of the interesting things that he says in his autobiography that came out of the Bob Dylan song is that not only was he looked askance at Hurricane Carter by whites, but even blacks called him a crazy nigga, is how Bob Dylan refers to it in his song. And roughly that's not far off. That is that, maybe he's kind of out there. And, Chris Rock's old line about I love black people, but I hate niggas, and a nigga's any black person who's done a crime. And so there were members of the black community that didn't stand in solidarity with this black man and see a clear link between social and racial oppression and his conviction and the way he was treated by the criminal justice system. So he was actually, at least initially, and people came around later, but at least initially, he was a social pariah. He was an outcast and had to stand through a lot of this with his own backbone and on his own 2 feet and without a lot of support.
Now, as you mentioned Bob Dylan, and we played the song a little bit earlier, he wasn't the only heavyweight to sort of go into Hurricane's corner. Others were Muhammad Ali, Burt Reynolds, and many others. Did that create sort of an inverse pressure, sort of the opposite force that we might have seen during the original trial to overturn the conviction? And were there really obvious holes in this case?
Yeah, this case really was a cause célèbre, no question, Andrew. It was a focus of a lot of attention and controversy. Or people were talking about its implications for understanding a lot of broader social issues. So it was a classic cause célèbre in that sense. And yes, it had a real impact ultimately, although those folks who stood behind him after his second conviction, many of them weren't still in his corner, as you say, to continue the boxing metaphor, because his first conviction was overturned because there was prosecutorial misconduct, quite a bit of prosecutorial misconduct, I might add, Andrew, just as in my father's case. I'm sorry.
How did it manifest? What kind of prosecutorial misconduct?
So specifically, the prosecutor concealed the fact that it had made deals with witnesses against Hurricane Carter, that it had promised them lenient treatment if they testified against Hurricane Carter, and then the prosecution did not tell that to the jury, so that the jury would know that when it was assessing the credibility of these witnesses. If you know the witnesses have cut a deal with the prosecution to testify against the defendant, you're likely to look a little more carefully and with more scrutiny and suspicion at the testimony because of the ulterior motives at play now. So there was that. There was the fact that one of the victims who was shot, who was an eyewitness when he was in the hospital, they brought in Hurricane Carter and his companion, and that victim said, no, that is not the person who pulled the trigger. So there was a lot of evidence along those lines. And then in the second trial, the prosecution's theory of the case was that this was a racial revenge murder. That Hurricane Carter, you know, that guy who's making all of those civil rights noises and racial justice noises, that there was a black bartender who was shot and killed down the street around the corner. So Hurricane Carter, acting as a ghetto avenger, you know, sought out this white barkeeper and shot him and the people in there to redress the balance. And that was his theory at trial, and he got a conviction on that. And the appellate court said, no, you had no basis for making that kind of argument, and all you did was inflame the jury. There was more prejudicial impact than probative value to it. No, you can't get a conviction on that basis. And every court that it was appealed to agreed with him with that court on that conclusion. So it did really look like a miscarriage of justice in a lot of ways. That's why the Hurricane Carter story still has a strong kind of iconic value, I think, Andrew, because it really very much looks like the case of an innocent black man railroaded. And I'm not saying all cases are that way, but it has that look and feel to it.